One of the most frustrating things about the home buying process is when the deal falls apart after you feel like everything is on the right track. It doesn't happen in every transaction, but when it does, usually there are a few common reasons behind it. What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Closing the Deal. I am one of your hosts, Zach Dickson, and sitting across from me today is my co-host, Sam Enright. And today we are talking about a discussion that does not happen quite enough in real estate, and that is what happens when a deal falls apart. Sam, what's going on this morning? How are you?
I am doing wonderful. Thank you for asking. I am excited to jump into today's episode because I think this is something that needs to be brought awareness to, for sure. Because oftentimes, we see this a lot on the pre-approval side where agents, buyers, they're asking for this keyword. They're asking for it to come out of our mouth. And we are very, very reluctant to use it. And that word is guarantee. There are no guarantees in real estate. I will just go ahead and preface this entire episode with that. And you guys are going to find that some of these things inside of here have absolutely nothing to do with the lending side of it. And so this is why we don't use the word guarantee, because there are a lot of components that go into purchasing a home, and not all of them are strictly based on you financing the home in the way that you need to. So just wanted to throw that in there, just a little sneak peek into what's to come.
Absolutely. Absolutely, honestly, because again, we've talked about it previously. There are so many moving parts in this transaction. There's a lot of things that are going on the backside of the transaction that necessarily some buyers don't even realize are happening in the background. Most transactions do go smoothly, just in general, generally speaking, they do, get to the closing table, get closed and face any hiccups along the way. But there are situations where a deal breaks down, and ultimately, the goal of the episode is to kind of shed some light on those situations, shed some light on some of the common reasons behind it, and hopefully, if you are a home buyer out there listening to this and you go through some of these situations, you're able to kind of navigate and come out on the other side a little bit easier because you've heard of them before.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's I had a thought and then the thought went away. So when it comes back, I will be sure to share that with you guys. But oh yeah, what I was thinking was just you talked about the backside of everything and not maybe most people fully understanding. And I just was sitting here thinking to myself, like, man, if you the buyer could sit down in a lender's shoes for the day and like just go through the whole transaction process of what actually it takes to make a loan go from the beginning stages to the clear to close stages when it comes to income, when it comes to banking, assets, credit, all these different things, right? Like it would blow your mind. We actually had an agent at one point in like 2020, 2021. She came over to our company and she was flipping, flipping from real estate to being a loan officer. And her just initial reaction was just like, I just had zero idea that all of this goes into making this happen, because ultimately, right, it's our job to shield most people from it. It's not necessarily a real estate agent's job to go through the lending process and to fully understand it. It's not the buyer's job. That's what we're here for. It's what we're getting paid for, is to make sure that ultimately your loan goes as smoothly as possible and that all the ducks are in a row and we're lining it up as it needs to be. But it is just funny just to kind of think about what an outside perspective of that transaction would be if you stepped into those shoes for a day and just really saw all the back end things that go on, the communication with an underwriter, the communication with an appraiser, all these different things that happen to make a transaction go. It's funny because obviously I've been doing it 8 years, so I don't really think about it in that way. It's just kind of second nature to me at this point, but it is always interesting thought process to kind of go back to, when I first started, like, what the heck are we doing here?
They would certainly be surprised. I know that for a fact. They would certainly be surprised. Um,
100%.
So getting started, one of the biggest, reasons why a deal falls apart is, like you mentioned, nothing to do on the lending side. The biggest thing that I see personally is due to inspections. You know, obviously the buyer is going to want the house that they just put an offer in on, had the offer accepted, the large financial purchase. Obviously, that is just it's just a given that the buyer is going to want that property to be inspected by a licensed home inspector. There are situations where the inspections are waived, etc., but generally speaking, the buyer is going to have the property inspected. And at this point, really anything wrong with the property is going to get called out. I know we've talked about the inspection report previously, and but I just want to hit on the fact that legitimately everything that is wrong with the property, as small as paint chipping up to major structural issues, are all called out on this property inspection. And it kind of takes buyers aback sometimes, and especially first time home buyers, when they see this 35, 40, 45 page inspection report with lists on lists and on lists of items that are listed on there, and they kind of get a little bit apprehensive, I think, when they see those inspection reports with such large quantities of issues. And typically, generally speaking, these issues are, most of them are not that big of a deal. 90-95% of them are going to be mild, very easy cosmetic fixes. But again, the reason why we do have the inspection report is to find the large issues, the structural issues, the roof problems, the mechanical problems with your HVAC, with your hot water tank, just issues with outdated systems, foundational issues. All of the above are going to be the things that kind of, maybe wreck a home buying deal. And so I think the big point that I would like to make in this aspect is no issue is too large to overcome. There are always ways to kind of get through these issues. Ultimately, as you get this inspection report as a buyer, you are able to kind of renegotiate at this point with the seller based on what is going on with these issues on their inspection report. And ultimately, why I think the deal falls through most times at this point is because, the buyer and the seller cannot find a meeting point. They cannot find a middle ground based on these issues. If you are a buyer and the inspection report tells you that you are going to, the roof is at its, at its useful age, it's going to need replaced, and you now take that back to the seller and either A, ask for the roof to be replaced in its entirety, or B, ask for a credit in the form of that roof being replaced, and the seller says no, that's ultimately their right. They can absolutely do that and decide to put the property back on the market. Now, and at that point, you are now out of that contract and have to go find a new home. But again, it goes back to you as the buyer deciding that you're going to stand firm on this. And if they decide that they don't want to do that, we're ready to terminate this deal. And that absolutely does happen, especially for some of those large issues like roof, HVAC, foundational issues as a whole.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I would like to just interject an example of this, because it's not always just, when looking at the inspection, it's not just a one size fits all either, because we actually had a client who was in contract on a home, had done a home inspection, and decided at the time that that home inspection was done, which, for those that don't know, home inspection is not required on the lending side. It is something that is encouraged for you to get, but we don't actually obtain those reports. We don't go through them. We don't look at them again. That is for your buyer's knowledge. So this buyer actually decided, after the inspection period was over, we ended up getting a termination of contract due to not being satisfied with the inspections. And 2 weeks later, we had another client who went in and offered on that house, different real estate agent, different client, offered on the house, did a home inspection, ended up purchasing the home. So it's not always, some buyers are going to be like, these are non-negotiables for me, right? This, on this report, I'm not willing to overlook. I'm not willing to move past. And other people are going to be like, no problem. I'll fix it myself. I know that this is an issue, whatever. I'll purchase the home. I'll take care of it on my own. So also something to consider there. It is very nuanced and is very buyer specific, right? Some buyers have things that, again, they're not going to let go. Others are just like, whatever, it is what it is. I'll make it work and go from there. So, that is something to keep in mind as well. And that's oftentimes, it is common, but it's not overly common for us to see that. I would say maybe 5% of the time do we have deals that truly end as soon as the inspection is back in, but it is out there, and those are something to obviously be aware of.
Yeah, great points there because again, the buying journey is very personalized. Again, you can kind of make decisions based on your personal interests and those are your decisions and ultimately you can that's your right to do so. And like you mentioned, I think generally speaking, they, when issues do arise, there is usually a middle ground that can be met between the buyer and seller. Ultimately, the seller usually doesn't want to go back to market and find a new buyer and have these issues still arise to the next buyer, because generally speaking, while it is personalized, if one issue is a problem for a buyer, especially if it's a large one like roof or HVAC, foundational stuff like that, it's probably going to be an issue for another buyer down the road as well. So moving on to the next segment, why don't you get us started talking about financing problems, financing issues and how those may affect, a deal falling apart.
Yeah, so financing issues. This is another one. This is probably, when people think about deals falling apart, likely the most common thing that people see happening or they think about happening is, well, what happens if my financing falls through? What happens if I can't, get the loan because of things on my end? And so I will tell you guys, obviously, the reality is that this does happen. We are not perfect human beings. We are not perfect in this business. There are things that are overlooked. There are clients who maybe do not disclose full information up front. And, we try to work through every problem, every situation that comes up, but ultimately, some may not be able to be overcome. So, things, just to get into some examples, obviously, before, I give you guys a little bit of a stress relief, is that, buyers changing jobs. This is something that we have had happen. I think I told you guys about this in, some of our craziest business stories. We had a client who literally quit her job, did not tell us. We went to go get we were clear to close, literally went to go get the final verbal verification of employment prior to close, find out she's no longer working there, call her up. She has no plans of going back to a different job. She's just like, oh, I just thought, my co-borrower could buy it with his income alone, just things like that, right? Like unfortunately, there's not really much we can do in a lending situation when it comes to that. That is just a complete, lack of information given. And obviously, we're going to do our due diligence on our end and make sure that things are still in the way that they should be. And when they're not, we try to work around solutions. But in that case, there was not really anything that could be done. New debt taken on in the process. This is another one where, let's say you got pre-approved a month ago and then inside that month you decided to go buy a new car and you didn't tell your lender about it. And we find out based on your banking, we see a deduction going to Capital One Auto. We cross-reference that with your credit report. There is no Capital One Auto on your credit report. All of a sudden there's a $500 car payment that we have to add into your debt to income ratio. That changes obviously everything when it comes to how you were pre-approved. And, maybe the debt to income ratios can't withstand that level of payment in there. And so now we have to go back to the drawing board, figure out, what options we have. If maybe it's not, maybe we don't have an option for this house. Maybe you're, only pre-qualified for $20,000 less than what you were previously qualified for. And this house is on the higher end of your budget, so things like that. Credit changes. This one is less common typically because obviously when we do pull a credit report, that credit report is going to stay in place for 120 days. But if you have gone and you've looked for homes and you find one at, day 90 or day, 110, and we have to repull your credit before the end of the transaction, and things have changed, scores drop, those sort of things, obviously that can play a factor into financing issues. So, that's always a conversation we have. Hey, once day 90 hits, if things, we're going to double check and make sure things have not changed with your credit since then to make sure that we're still in a good position to get you this home that you're going and offering on. And then obviously income documentation issues. This one, again, is something that can be common. Obviously, it's something we try to avoid by getting the documentation up front, by doing our due diligence and making sure that the income that we are using is underwriter proof, meaning We look at it from an underwriting standpoint. We take a look at, okay, hey, what does the income look like over the last 2 years? Are we variable? Are we working consistent 40 hours a week? What did we get raises? Is there bonus? Is there overtime income that can be used? All these different things that go into calculating income, right? Those are things that we're going to look at in the pre-approval stage, and try to alleviate as many of those problems that could possibly come up down the road. So if you're somebody who has a little bit more complex income, we're always going to do our due diligence up front to make sure that that income is ironclad before we even send you out looking for homes. So I guess that is my biggest thing. My biggest takeaway is, obviously, when you work with a lender, when you work with a great lender, they're going to do a lot of the due diligence on the financing side, because ultimately, when you look at it from our perspective, what is inside of our control? I can't control inspection issues. I can't control appraisal issues, but what I can control is financing issues. What I can control is making sure that all of our ducks are in a row before we even send you out looking for homes. And again, that doesn't mean that things aren't going to pop up. That doesn't mean that things aren't going to change. I was just on the phone yesterday with a client who's looking to get pre-approved, and he was very upfront and honest. Hey, I am in the talks with maybe going to a new job where it will actually pay me more. Here's kind of the situation. I'm not sure if that's going to happen, what that timeline looks like. That, for a lender, is music to my ears. I can help navigate that situation when I know what the situation is, much easier than if you don't tell me that, or that's not disclosed. And then all of a sudden we're 25 days into contract and you're like, yeah, I switched jobs. Now we got to go get an extension. Now we got to break the news to everybody that, hey, and there's going to be a lot of unhappy parties in that, right? And so when we have the information up front, we can obviously do our due diligence and make sure that all of these things are lined up as they should be, and hopefully alleviate a lot of these financing concerns when it comes to that. So, like I said, we won't use the word guarantee, but I will tell you, after you get done with the pre-approval process with our team, we are very much so, hey, your financing side, that's locked in. I can't make any guarantees about your inspection, about the home you're going to find, your appraisal, any of that. But I can tell you right now that we have done our due diligence on your end when it comes to your income, your assets, your credit, all those sort of things. Everything looks good there. So as long as everything else falls into place, we should be fine.
Absolutely. Honestly, great points there. And I think one thing I just would like to add on that side of things is, the bill of responsibility does fall on you as the home buyer a little bit in this aspect as well. You need to be making sure that you're not making credit changes, taking on new debt. Like, those are the things that a lender can't really control. You as the buyer can absolutely go open a new credit card and max it out, or can go get a new car and, take on that entire new debt and change your debt to income ratio. So I think, while the lender is going to do his due diligence and make sure everything is in place, the bill of responsibility does fall on the buyer in some sort of fashion as well, to make sure that you're not doing these things that will, ruin the deal down the road.
Or just being
Yeah.
honest about the things that are happening. You know what I mean? Not saying don't go get a car, not saying don't do those things if that's what you desperately need, but let's be upfront and honest about that conversation at the time. If you're going to go take on a new $500 car payment and you were pre-approved without it, like, I know maybe don't understand the lending side of things, but that is going to cause problems when it comes to your pre-approval numbers. You can't just interject a $500 payment and expect nothing to change. So just something to think about there as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. As we move into the next segment of the episode, and our next big issue that we run into and that causes deals to fail, it is going to be appraisal issues. If you're financing a home, a new property, you're going to be required to get an appraisal on the property, which is a value of the property itself. Now, ultimately, we've talked about previously, the value of the property is what somebody's willing to pay. But ultimately, the financier needs to have a third party unbiased opinion of how much this property is actually worth, because again, they're not going to be lending on a property over and above what it is actually worth. And so when this appraisal comes in, and it may come in low under the contract price, say you go into contract at $275,000, the appraised price comes in at 260. So that's 15 grand of kind of makeup that needs to be negotiated between the buyer and seller, similarly to the inspection results. Some of the different outcomes are the buyer brings that $15,000 in extra cash. They have to pull that out of their pocket. Sometimes the seller will lower the purchase price down to meet that $260,000 number. Or, again, we kind of find a middle ground between the two and say, the buyer will bring $5,000 in extra cash, and the seller will lower that down to $265,000 instead of, the 275. And so kind of meet in the middle there and negotiate that. But again, just like the inspection results, sometimes neither side they're not going to be able to agree to a satisfied outcome. And while that isn't really common, I don't think, usually you're going to be able to find a middle ground. Usually you're going to be able to find a desired outcome for both parties. It does absolutely happen, and kind of have to be, just prepared in general for that road to present itself, that obstacle to present itself, and have to figure out how we can move forward. And maybe just have in the back of your mind that you do have a little bit more extra savings, to where you could bring a little bit more cash on hand to complete the deal if necessary. But again, generally speaking, these things are negotiable. And I've hit it home, beat the dead horse a lot, that everything in real estate is negotiable, and everything on this side is negotiable as well. But ultimately, you cannot kind of get around a lower appraisal price. You can't just say, oh, it came in $15,000 low, we're going to be good, everything's fine. Something has to be done, whether it's on your side as a buyer, or whether it's on the seller's side, or, again, a combination of the both of those.
Yeah. And I just want to add in a couple of things there, because, ultimately it is the appraiser's discretion as well. If there's, structural or, safety things that are being called out, obviously, for government backed loan programs, you're going to have the HUD 4000.1, which is, what, decides, kind of the appraisal requirements for USDA and FHA. So sometimes there's going to be repairs and certain things that are called out on those reports that are going to need to be done. To make it meet, FHA or USDA standards. Obviously, conventional, typically is going to be a little bit less likely on that side, but they're not perfect either. Not every conventional appraisal comes in as is, contrary to popular belief out there. There are still sometimes things that can, be required on those as well. And then, there's another side of it. I remember last year or 2 years ago, we had a loan that we were doing for a lady who had built basically a barn dominium and put an apartment or a house inside of the barn dominium, and we had an appraisal go out on it, and it did not pass the appraisal, what the appraisal requirements were for conventional to make that happen as well. So it's not always just about, price and those sort of things. Obviously, yes, when you have a typical stick built home, you're going to not really run into issues when it comes to like the way it's structured and all that sort of stuff. But, some people do have unique situations. And obviously, as I guess maybe the market and the world has come along, these barn dominiums, these different types of homes have become more and more popular. And so it's just something to think about on that. If you are buying a unique type of property, I've seen people that are trying to buy a house, an old school that was converted to a house. You have to think about, are there light comps out there? There's other factors that go into an appraisal other than just price, when it comes to those sort of things. So we do have to be cautious of that we have seen very small percentage, probably less than 1%, but we have seen some interesting situations like that pop up where, there's just not enough light comps to make the situation make sense.
Yeah, great points there. And again, just to kind of reiterate, when these kind of repairs pop up on the appraisal, those aren't negotiable. Those do have to be completed.
Correct.
So again, the seller can they can choose to terminate the deal at that point. Absolutely. That is their right. But to move forward, they need to get those repairs fixed and taken care of to move forward in this specific contract. And again, on the government backside as well, if the property has an appraisal and they decide not to do the repairs that are specified on there, that one is going to stick with the property as well. So if they have another buyer that is going to be FHA, make an offer FHA a month later after going back on the market, that appraisal is going to stick there and those repairs are going to stick there. So they're going to have to do those at some point. So kind of a leverage point for the first buyer there to kind of say, hey, these are going to stick with your property. If you do go back to market, you're not going to be able to go with an FHA buyer. And, that might be a good, point of leverage for you as the buyer to be able to kind of get those things taken care of and make sure that they're aware of that as well. So
for sure. Great points. I want to take you guys into obviously another thing that we see, which is timeline problems. So this is another one that, I would say on this list that we've covered so far, I would say this is another one that definitely can pop up, but doesn't necessarily always kill deals or make them fall apart, but it is very, very common, I guess, is what I want to say. This is probably the most common one that pops up on the list, right? Where we have to get extensions or buyers need a certain amount of time, different things, right? So obviously examples of that I already talked about, buyers needing more time for financing, right? So if there have been some issues that have popped up, if in the job example, right, we get to day 21 of a 28-day contract and you switch jobs that day, we now have to wait for a new pay stub to come available, which is likely going to be 2 weeks from your start date, if not maybe 3 weeks, right? Because your first 2 weeks you're going to get paid and then you're going to wait a week and get your paycheck, So that would then inject another additional 2 weeks that we would have to extend out the contract in order to make this work. With this, obviously closing dates just shifting unexpectedly for whatever that is, when you have, repairs that need to be done, that is going to obviously take hold and obviously take time, right? We just had a client who's in contract right now and their inspection period came back. There was quite a few things that got called out and we had to wait basically a week and a half to order the appraisal. Now that doesn't necessarily always guarantee that the loan is going to have to be extended or the contract's going to need to be extended, but it is one of those things that just needs to be, thought about. Obviously anything that comes up that we're talking about, appraisals, financing issues, inspection issues, all of these things, right, lead to this issue right here, which is timeline issue. Anytime you write a 28-day contract and you're expecting things to flow perfectly and things do not flow perfectly, you're normally going to have some run over where you may need some additional days to get everything wrapped up and taken care of. And then obviously, I would say when you may see it truly fall apart, right, is when a seller maybe doesn't live in the house and it's vacant, or when you have an investor who bought it, flipped it, and now they're wanting to, sell it, right? Those folks probably are less inclined to maybe hang around for an additional 2 to 3 weeks if their ultimate goal is I just need to get this thing off the market, right? I need to get it sold. I know that we normally will balance out, hey, does it make more sense to go back to market, wait another 30 days, maybe you wait another 14 days for an offer and then you got to wait another 30-day contract period. But if they feel inside of these conversations that there is a chance that this could fall through anyways, they obviously may be in the position where they're like, I don't know about that. I'm going to take it back to market. I will tell you guys, in my experience that I've seen, I have not seen very many deals fall apart because of timeline issues. Like truly like, hey, we need an extension. Nope, not doing it. We're taking the home back to market and you guys are just kind of out of luck. Haven't seen that too often, but we do see timeline issues pop up where we do need extensions. Obviously, it's not usually a very fun conversation to have with most people, but we do get through it and obviously get the extensions that we need and make the thing happen. So
absolutely, just kind of another example of another negotiation that can be negotiated, and just again, it all comes back to open lines of communication and having those. Typically, most human beings are going to be open to changes when open lines of communication are had. Sometimes I think people are apprehensive about changes when, those things aren't communicated very clearly, and just kind of sprung on somebody at the very last moment. That's usually where we see people are apprehensive about making those changes. So like you mentioned, very typical to, have both parties agree to extensions, etc. But again, if you are kind of just pushing the can or kicking the can down the road and not really talking about these things when you know that they need to happen, that is usually when people are a little bit more apprehensive about not wanting to do that.
Yeah, guys. So obviously inside of all of that, there can be some things where maybe your takeaway is, oh my gosh, there maybe a little bit of fear, right, around all of these potential downfalls that can happen that would cause, your transaction to fall through, for you to not buy the home. The reality is that in most cases, most real estate transactions are going to be successful. When you go in a contract, most oftentimes you're going to be able to get to the closing table, get the keys in your hand, and own that home, right? So like if I look at our side of things, refinances aside, because that's a completely different beast when it comes to appraisals and those sort of things. But on most purchase transactions, I would say that we are at a 95 to 97% success rate, meaning when we get a client that goes in a contract, 95 to 97% of the time, we are getting them to the closing table and they are buying that home, right? And I would say inside of that, I just want to leave you guys with that thought of, this is not necessarily, we're not saying that all of these things are going to happen inside of one transaction. We're not also saying that inside of these issues that they cannot be resolved. As Zach talked about, everything is negotiable. So no matter what, even if your appraisal comes in low, it's not an automatic, okay, we're done, right? The biggest thing on this part that I think is for most of you is the inspection. That is the number one thing that is usually going to be I can't make it past this. The other stuff, oftentimes going to be very, very negotiable, very easy to work around. And it just may take some extra time. But I wanted to leave you guys with that parting thought. I didn't want you guys to think that, ultimately that these things are just going to all happen and your deal's going to fall apart. But just being aware that these things are potential, they do have potential to happen, and how to understand them and combat them when they do, I think is really, really important. So just trying to ultimately bring awareness to the realities of the business without, fear mongering you into believing that every deal is going to fall apart.
No, that's kind of where I was going to go as well. Is just being aware of those are going to help you kind of make better decisions as a whole too. Like if those kind of things just don't, or they just pop up on you without, preparation or awareness as a whole, you're just going to feel a little bit more stressed and a little bit more, just under the gun to make a decision. And usually, like we've talked about, those decisions are not going to be the best decisions when you're just under the gun with no preparation, no awareness. And so again, yeah, typically speaking, if we're going to get to the closing table, we might run into issues like this, but generally speaking, they are mostly solvable and mostly do get solved. But again, just having the awareness is going to be key in these scenarios as a whole. So
yeah, for sure. I mean, I know for buyers, like this stuff feels like a huge mountain, but for most, for you and I, for most people in this business, this stuff is typically just an average Tuesday. So, it's just one of those things that we just see happen a lot, and once you put yourself in that position enough, you gain confidence on how to navigate around it. And so it's never just, oh, hey, you put a new car loan on your credit. Oh, just deal's done. No way to figure it out. Obviously we're going to put our nose to the grindstone and figure out how we can ultimately help you still maintain the home and those sort of things. It's never just, if one of these things pops up, it's, better luck next time. We're always going to do our due diligence and figure out how to help you out.
Absolutely. Well, I think that wraps us up for today's episode. Hopefully you guys enjoyed and are now aware of, some of the major causes of why a deal may fall apart and how we can, kind of combat them and go get through them as a whole. So again, hopefully you guys found some good value from today's episode. And again, guys, drop new episodes weekly every Friday at noon. Again, on all podcast platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, have the video form on YouTube. And also, we give our 3 clips, 3 reels each week on all of the, social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram. And again, hopefully you guys enjoyed today's episode, and we will see you guys on the next one.
See you guys.